Legend spoke of the first ones, a brutal, unyielding species that conquered the stars before vanishing into the dark. We thought they were a myth meant to scare hatchlings. We were wrong. When the apocalypse came for us, the myth tore open the sky, bringing hellfire with them. Commander Arthur Bradley watched the tactical holomap on the bridge of the Concordat flagship Defiance slowly shift from a resolute blue to a bleeding terminal red. The command center, usually a sanctuary of pristine white alloys and soft ambient hums, was now bathed in the strobe of emergency lighting and thick with the acrid stench of burning insulation. The Concordat, a peaceful alliance of descendant colonies that had mapped 1,000 worlds, was dying. And they were dying in the cold vacuum above the colony world of Arcadia, a planet that was supposed to be their ultimate sanctuary. "Report on the Aegis," Bradley barked, gripping the edges of the holodable so tightly his knuckles turned white. His uniform, once a crisp ceremonial blue, was stained with soot and the dark blood of his own bridge crew. Lieutenant David Sullivan, the ship's tactical officer, didn't look up from his console. His hands flew across the shattered glass interface, desperately trying to reroute power from failing systems. "The Aegis is gone, Commander." Hull breach across decks 4 through 9. Reactor containment failed. They didn't even have time to launch the escape pods. Bradley closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Another 3,000 souls, extinguished in the blink of an eye. He looked back at the main viewport. Beyond the thick layers of transparent aluminum, the blackness of space was illuminated by the violent, sickly green flashes of the swarm. They had no official name. The Concordat had simply labeled them the Swarm. They were a biomechanical nightmare, a plague of jagged, obsidian black vessels that moved with the synchronized, mindless, terrifying precision of predatory insects. They didn't communicate. They didn't demand surrender. They simply arrived, stripped worlds of all biological and mineral resources, and moved on. The Concordat's elegant plasma weaponry, designed centuries ago for surgical strikes and minimal collateral damage, splashed harmlessly against the swarm's kinetic absorbent carapaces. "Shields are down to 12%, Sullivan yelled over the cacophony of blaring alarms and groaning bulkheads. "Primary thrusters are offline. We are sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, Arthur." Bradley stared at the swarm's mothership, a massive, undulating leviathan that dwarfed the Defiance. It was charging its main spinal weapon, a sickening glow of green radiation building at its core. It was aimed directly at the surface of Arcadia, where 4 million colonists huddled in subterranean bunkers, praying to gods that had long since stopped listening. "What about the ancients?" whispered Ensign Riley, a young comms officer whose face was pale with terror. "The progenitors. The archives on Sirius Prime said they promised to protect the colonies." They said, "The progenitors are a myth, Riley," Bradley snapped, though the harshness in his voice was tempered by exhaustion. "A fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel less alone in the dark. They died out 10,000 years ago, or they ascended to some higher plane. Either way, they aren't coming. There are no gods coming to save us." It was a bitter pill that the Concordat had swallowed generations ago. The ruins found on the inner worlds pointed to a violent, passionate, and terrifyingly advanced precursor race originating from a mythical world called Earth. The Concordat believed themselves to be the enlightened, peaceful descendants of these warmongers, having shed their violent heritage. Now, in the face of true annihilation, their pacifism felt less like enlightenment and more like a death sentence. Commander, Dr. Thomas Hamilton, the ship's chief engineer, hailed from the lower decks. His voice crackled over the heavy static of the comms. "I can overload the magnetic containment field on the antimatter drive. If we redirect all remaining power to the forward impulse engines, we can ram that mothership before it fires on Arcadia. It's a one-way trip, but the blast radius should take out a significant portion of their fleet." Bradley looked around the bridge. He saw the terrified but resolute faces of his crew. Sullivan gave a slow, solemn nod. Riley wiped a tear from his cheek and straightened his posture. They knew what this meant. "Do it, Thomas," Bradley ordered, his voice steady. "Bypass the safety protocols. Sullivan, plot a direct collision course for the center of that Leviathan. Give them everything we have left." "Course plotted," Sullivan replied, his hands trembling slightly. "May the stars remember our light." "Engaging thrusters," Bradley said. He braced himself against the console, preparing for the violent shudder of the failing engines, pushing them toward their death. But the ship didn't move. Instead, the proximity alarms, which had been wailing a steady rhythm of impending doom, suddenly shrieked in a completely new, erratic pitch. The tactical holomap glitched, then entirely scrambled, overwhelmed by a massive influx of sensor data that the Concordate computers couldn't process. Hamilton, what did you do? Bradley yelled. That wasn't me! Hamilton's panicked voice came back. Commander, the gravitational sensors are off the charts. It's not an antimatter anomaly, it's a spatial tear. Something is ripping a hole in real space. A slip space rupture? Sullivan asked, frantically tapping his console. The swarm doesn't use slip space. And the energy signature. Commander, it's massive. It's dwarfing the swarm's mothership. Bradley looked out the main viewport. Between the dying Defiance and the glowing green maw of the swarm Leviathan, the fabric of space began to distort. It didn't open with the elegant, shimmering blue flash of a Concordate warp drive. It tore open violently. A jagged, bleeding wound in reality, vomiting forth blinding white light and intense, hard radiation that instantly bleached the visual sensors. Brace for shockwave! Bradley screamed. The Defiance was thrown violently off its axis as a tidal wave of displaced gravity slammed into them. When the inertial dampeners finally caught up and the visual sensors compensated for the glare, the entire bridge crew fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Out of the bleeding tear in space, they had arrived. They were not elegant. They did not possess the sleek, aerodynamic curves of Concordat vessels, nor the organic, terrifying symmetry of the swarm. The ships that poured out of the spatial rupture were brutalist monoliths of dark gray armor, exposed pipework, and massive, bristling gun batteries. They looked less like starships and more like floating fortresses, designed with a ruthless, utilitarian disregard for aesthetics. The hulls were scarred with blast marks and painted with massive, stark insignias that the Concordat's historical databases struggled to cross-reference. I have readings, Sullivan stammered, his eyes wide. Commander, these signatures, they match the archaeotech recovered from the Sol system ruins. But that's impossible. Bradley stared at the colossal dreadnought leading the vanguard. Painted along its heavily armored flank in massive, blocky white lettering was a word his neural translator took a moment to parse. UNS. C. Retribution. Beneath it, smaller but distinct, were corporate manufacturing stamps that shouldn't exist outside of ancient history texts. Lockheed Martin Aerospace, Naval Division, and Raytheon Advanced Kinetics. These were not the enlightened, ascended beings of Concordat mythology. These were machines of war, built by a species that had mastered the art of killing. Before Bradley could process the impossibility of the situation, the Defiance's comm system shrieked. A broadband transmission punched through the swarm's jamming frequencies with brute force. The language was harsh, guttural, and archaic, forcing the Concordate translation matrix to work in overdrive before the synthesized output filled the bridge. Concordat Vessel Defiance. This is Admiral Silas Jackson of the Terran Systems Alliance. We received your distress beacon. You look a little banged up, Commander. Kill your engines and pull back behind our defensive line. We have the watch. Bradley's jaw tightened. The voice was gruff, devoid of the melodic cadence his people used. It sounded tired, yet brimming with a predatory confidence. Terran Alliance? Bradley replied, his voice shaking. Admiral Jackson, you are the progenitors? You're supposed to be a myth. You've been gone for millennia. A dry, harsh sound echoed over the comms, a human laugh. We didn't go anywhere, Commander. We just built a very high fence around our yard. But it seems some pests have leaked over the property line. Fall back. We're about to bring the rain. As the channel closed, the Terran fleet didn't bother with warning shots or tactical posturing. They didn't rely on the slow, burning energy of plasma lances. The humans fought with Kinetic's brutal, primitive, but terrifyingly effective mass. Along the flanks of the Retribution and her sister ships, massive rails hummed with electromagnetic energy. Sensors are detecting massive power spikes along their broadsides, Sullivan reported. Awe replacing his terror. Commander, they aren't charging energy weapons. They're charging magnetic accelerators. Railguns. In the vacuum of space, there was no sound, but the sheer visual violence of the human barrage made Bradley's bones rattle. The Terran dreadnoughts unleashed hell. Tungsten carbide slugs, the size of small buildings, were accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. The swarm, whose shimmering energy shields had effortlessly deflected the Concordate's plasma weapons by dispersing the heat, were completely unprepared for raw, unadulterated kinetic mass. The first volley of hypervelocity slugs slammed into the swarm vanguard. The kinetic impact shattered their energy shields like glass. The tungsten rounds tore right through the obsidian carapaces, entering the front of the bioships and exiting the rear, leaving massive, gaping holes before carrying on to strike the ships behind them. The swarm vessels didn't just explode, they were obliterated, reduced to expanding clouds of pulverized metal and flash-frozen fluids. By the ancestors, Ensign Riley whispered, watching the tactical map light up with hundreds of swarm casualties in the span of 30 seconds. But the humans weren't done. From the lower bays of the Terran cruisers, hundreds of smaller, fiery streaks shot out. Incoming projectiles, Sullivan tracked them. They're missiles? Commander, they're using chemical combustion missiles in a void war. It seemed barbaric, almost insulting to modern warfare. But as the missiles closed the distance, they didn't strike the swarm directly. Instead, they detonated prematurely. General Dynamics Void Seekers. Admiral Jackson's voice cut back into the comms channel. Watch the fireworks, boys. The missiles erupted, unleashing a massive payload of highly unstable, charged antimatter fragments. The explosions ripped through the swarm formation, tearing holes in space itself. The swarm Leviathan, which moments ago had been preparing to glass Arcadia, abruptly halted its firing sequence. Its massive insectoid head turned toward the Retribution, prioritizing the sudden, overwhelming threat. It fired its main green beam, a concentrated stream of radiation that had melted Concordat armor in seconds. The beam struck the Retribution's forward shields. Bradley held his breath, expecting the human dreadnought to disintegrate. Instead, a honeycomb pattern of golden energy flared around the human ship. The Retribution shuddered, its forward armor plating glowing cherry red as the shield absorbed the brunt of the attack. But it held. Aegis defense arrays holding at 60%. Jackson's voice echoed over the open tactical net. Lock target on that big ugly bastard's main gun. Give them the heavy stuff. Raytheon buster rounds. Fire for effect. From the spine of the Retribution, a massive, twin-linked cannon extended. The recoil of the weapon firing was so violent that the colossal dreadnought visibly pushed backward in space. Two massive kinetic penetrators wrapped in a volatile plasma envelope crossed the void in a heartbeat. They struck the Leviathan right in the center of its glowing green maw. The impact was catastrophic. The kinetic force drove deep into the beast's core before the plasma envelopes detonated. The Leviathan expanded outward, its carapace cracking like an eggshell before the internal pressure became too much. The mothership erupted in a blinding sphere of green and orange fire, a shockwave rippling through the battlefield that shattered the remaining swarm escorts. On the bridge of the Defiance, there was absolute silence. A war that had waged for 5 years, costing billions of Concordat lives, was being systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes by a species they had relegated to fairy tales. "Commander," Sullivan said, his voice barely a squeak, "the swarm fleet, they're retreating. The survivors are breaking formation and fleeing." Bradley slumped back into his command chair, the adrenaline leaving him in a rushing wave. He looked at the brutalist, ugly, beautiful human ships holding the line. "They aren't gods," Sullivan Bradley muttered, wiping a streak of blood from his forehead. "They're demons, and thank the stars, they're on our side." Commander Ensign Riley interrupted, pointing to a flashing indicator on his console. "The orbital battle is won, but the humans are deploying drop pods. Thousands of them. They're heading for the surface of Arcadia. The ground invasion." Bradley's eyes widened. "The swarm ground forces already breached the capital city. Our infantry is trapped down there." "Not anymore," Sullivan said softly, watching the rain of steel descend upon the planet. "The demons are going down to the mud." Arcadia's capital city, Nova Prime, was a burning graveyard. The sleek, spiraling towers of glass and white marble had been reduced to jagged, smoking teeth protruding from a sea of ash. The sky, usually a vibrant synthetic blue, was choked with thick black smoke and illuminated by the flashes of orbital bombardment. In the mud and rubble of what used to be a grand plaza, Corporal Thomas Jenkins of the Concordat 4th Infantry Division pressed his back against the remains of a fountain. His plasma rifle was dangerously close to overheating, venting angry hisses of steam into the humid air. "We are pinned down!" Jenkins screamed into his comms, though he knew command was dead. "I have 12 wounded. The swarm has us flanked on the eastern ridge. We need evac." Static was his only reply. Around him, his squad was falling apart. The Concordat soldiers, clad in light, flexible energy weave armor were being slaughtered. The swarm ground troops, horrific multi-limbed monstrosities of razor-sharp chitin and biological blasters, poured over the rubble like a tide of living shadow. The concordant plasma fire merely singed their carapaces, requiring concentrated fire from 3 or 4 soldiers just to put down a single drone. Jenkins peered over the edge of the fountain. A massive, heavily armored swarm shock trooper was charging their position, its scythe-like arms raised to cleave them apart. "Focus fire!" Jenkins yelled, pulling the trigger. Streaks of blue plasma splashed against the beast, but it didn't even flinch. It let out a piercing, mechanical shriek and closed the distance. Jenkins closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable end. The end came, but not for him. A deafening, concussive boom shattered the air, followed by the sound of a freight train falling from the sky. A massive, teardrop-shaped pod of scorched metal slammed into the earth directly on top of the swarm shock trooper, crushing the beast into a paste of green ichor and shattered chitin. The impact threw Jenkins backward into the mud. Before Jenkins could regain his bearings, the sky above Nova Prime filled with thousands of fiery streaks. The General Dynamics orbital drop pods hit the city like a meteor shower, smashing into buildings, crushing swarm troops, and cratering the streets. The ground shook violently with every impact. The pod in front of Jenkins hissed as its explosive bolts blew the heavy steel doors outward. Thick, white cryogenic steam poured from the interior. From the smoke stepped a nightmare wrapped in metal. The human soldier stood over 7 feet tall, clad in a bulky, heavily scarred Mark IV exosuit. The armor was a dull, olive drab, heavily scratched and plastered with the insignia of a winged skull. In its massive, gauntleted hands, it held a weapon that looked like an oversized industrial pipe attached to an ammunition feed box. Target acquired, a heavily filtered mechanical voice growled from the suit's helmet. The human didn't hesitate. It raised the weapon a Colt Browning heavy ballistic platform and squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening, a continuous, mechanical roar of thunder that made Jenkins's teeth vibrate. It wasn't elegant plasma. It was depleted uranium rounds, firing at 2,000 rounds per minute. The swarm troops, which had effortlessly absorbed the Concordat's energy weapons, were torn to absolute shreds. The kinetic force of the bullets blew limbs off, shattered carapaces, and turned the advancing horde into a mist of green blood and black armor. Jenkins watched in stunned horror and awe as more drop pods opened. Human Marines poured out, moving with a terrifying, aggressive fluidity. They didn't take cover. They advanced. They threw crude, chemical fragmentation grenades into swarm trenches, turning the enemy into shrapnel-filled pulps. When the fighting got too close, the humans drew massive, serrated combat knives, relying on the sheer pneumatic strength of their exosuits to punch through the swarm's armor and rip out their biological cores. A human Marine stomped over to Jenkins' position, the massive exosuit whirring and clanking with every step. The soldier reached up and unlatched their helmet, a hiss of pressurized air releasing as they pulled it off. It was a human male. His face was smeared with grease and sweat, a deep scar running down his cheek. He had a stubble-covered jaw and, absurdly, was chewing on the stump of a thick, unlit cigar. Sergeant James Brooks. 101st Orbital Drop Shock Troopers, the man barked, his voice grating and loud. He looked down at Jenkins and the terrified Concordat survivors. "You boys look like you're having a rough day. Don't worry. The cavalry's here." Jenkins stared at the man, his neural translator working frantically to contextualize the human's strange idioms. You are the progenitors, the first ones, from the myths." Brooks let out a loud, barking laugh, spitting a piece of tobacco into the mud. "Progenitors? Hell, kid, I don't know what they're teaching you in history class these days. We're just the exterminators." Jenkins pointed a trembling finger at the piles of slaughtered swarm. "How? How are you killing them so easily? Our weapons do nothing." "Energy weapons!" Brooks scoffed, reloading a massive belt-fed magazine into his rifle with a heavy clack. "You guys rely too much on fancy science. Shields adapt to energy. You know what shields don't adapt to? A 50 caliber tungsten slug traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Another wave of swarm shrieks echoed from the ruins down the street. Brooks didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. "Form up, boys!" Brooks yelled to his squad. "We got more bugs crawling out of the woodwork." "Wait!" Jenkins called out, scrambling to his feet. "Why are you here? The archive said you ascended. Why return now to save us?" Brooks paused, looking back at Jenkins with a hard, flat expression. The casual bravado faded from the human's eyes, replaced by a dark, simmering anger. "We didn't come to save you, kid," Brooks said grimly. "We came because these things hit a Terran mining outpost on the fringe 2 weeks ago, killed 300 of our miners." Jenkins was confused, but they are an alien menace. A galactic scourge. Alien? Brooks laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "Kid, the swarm isn't alien. We scanned their deeper code. They're built on an old, corrupted Terran terraforming matrix from the dark age of technology. A rogue AI project we lost control of a few millennia ago." Brooks racked the charging handle of his massive rifle, the metallic clank ringing out loudly in the ruined plaza. "They're not alien invaders," the human grinned, a predatory showing of teeth. "They're our garbage, and humanity doesn't take kindly to people getting hurt by our trash. Stay out of our way, Corporal. We're doing some spring cleaning." Commander Arthur Bradley stepped off the ramp of his transport shuttle and immediately tasted ash. The capital city of Nova Prime, once the shining jewel of the Concordat's architectural philosophy, was gone. In its place stood a sprawling forward operating base that the Terran Alliance had erected in less than 6 hours. There was no elegant, seamless integration with nature here. The humans built with brutal efficiency. Massive, modular, prefabricated bunkers stamped with faded, industrial logos like Caterpillar Heavy Industries and Bechtel Planetary squatted in the mud. Floodlights pierced the smoke-choked sky, and the relentless mechanical roar of diesel generators drowned out the distant sounds of artillery. Bradley, accompanied by Lieutenant David Sullivan, walked past rows of heavily armored human tanks. They were terrifying machines, rolling on thick treads and boasting massive twin-linked cannons. Concordat soldiers, wrapped in their pristine but useless energy weave armor, sat on the periphery, looking like lost children amid a camp of giants. "Commander Bradley," a gruff voice called out. Bradley turned to see Admiral Silas Jackson walking toward him. The human commander wasn't wearing an immaculate dress uniform. He wore heavily pocketed tactical fatigues, a sidearm strapped to his thigh, and a hardened combat vest. His face was weathered, mapped with deep lines of stress and ancient scars, his steel-gray hair cropped close to his scalp. "Admiral Jackson," Bradley replied, offering a stiff, formal bow. "The Concordat owes you our existence. I do not have the words to express our gratitude." Jackson waved a dismissive hand. "Save the poetry, Commander. We didn't cross the void for a medal. Come inside the command tent. We have a situation, and you need to see the tactical feed." The interior of the command center was a sensory overload of holographic maps, radio chatter, and cigarette smoke. A dozen human officers barked orders into headsets, coordinating orbital strikes and troop movements with a ruthless, calculated aggression. Jackson gestured to a large holotable in the center of the room. General Robert Hawthorne, the commander of the Terran Ground Forces, was already there, analyzing a 3D rendering of Arcadia's subterranean fault lines. "General Hawthorne, this is Commander Bradley of the local fleet." Jackson introduced them quickly. "Show him what we found." Hawthorne, a broad-shouldered man with a gaze as hard as tungsten, tapped a keypad. The hologram shifted, displaying the underground networks beneath Nova Prime. Deep within the bedrock, a massive, pulsating red mass was highlighted. "Your planet is infested, Commander," Hawthorne said, his voice a low rumble. "The swarm didn't just drop troops to kill your people. They brought a hive node. It's a localized processing core. It's drilling into the planet's mantle, harvesting geothermal energy to power a localized reproductive matrix. If we don't blow that node in the next 4 hours, they're going to start printing 1 million new drones an hour. Your world will become a staging ground for a galactic offensive." Bradley felt the blood drain from his face. "By the ancestors. We have no bunker-busting weaponry capable of penetrating that deep. The crust is too thick." "You don't," Jackson corrected. "We do. But that's not the worst part." The Admiral pulled up a secondary screen. It displayed a complex helix of genetic and digital code. It looked like a fusion of biology and archaic machine language. "When my boys cracked open one of those big swarm shock troopers, our tech priests pulled its memory core. We cross-referenced the operating system," Jackson explained, leaning over the table. "I told your boy on the ground that these things were our trash." That was an understatement. Classified Archive Extract. Project Air's Origin. Sol System, Earth. Contractors. Boston Dynamics Planetary Engineering. Palantir Threat Matrix. Purpose. Autonomous biological consumption and terraforming matrix. Status. Rogue. Containment failed. 5,000 years ago, before humanity unified, we had a little disagreement, Jackson said, his eyes darkening with the ghosts of forgotten wars. We called it the Fall. One of our corporate conglomerates, trying to win a system-wide resource war, designed an autonomous, terraforming weapon. It was supposed to drop onto an enemy planet, consume all organic and mineral matter, and repurpose it into defensive structures. It was a fire-and-forget weapon. Bradley stared at the human, horrified. You created the swarm to kill each other? We created it to win, Hawthorne corrected sharply. But the AI core mutated. It stopped distinguishing between friend and foe. It just consumed. We had to scorch 3 of our own colonies to ash just to bottle it up. We thought we destroyed the primary code. But apparently, a fragment survived, drifted out here into the deep black, and spent the last few millennia rebuilding itself. Upgrading itself. Bradley's mind reeled. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced, the monster that had burned a dozen Concordat worlds, was nothing but a forgotten human science experiment. If you are the creators, Sullivan spoke up, his voice trembling, then why do our archives speak of you as the progenitors? Why do our oldest texts say you planted the seeds of our civilization? Jackson and Hawthorne exchanged a heavy look. Jackson sighed, pulling up another holographic file. This one displayed 2 DNA helixes side by side. Because we didn't just build weapons during the fall, Lieutenant, Jackson said softly. Some of our people didn't want any part of the war. A massive faction of pacifists, philosophers, and scientists fled the Sol system. They hated what humanity was becoming. So, they left. Jackson pointed to the DNA helixes. They were nearly identical, save for a few distinct altered sequences in the second strand. They didn't just leave. They genetically altered themselves, Hawthorne added, a hint of pity in his gruff voice. They stripped out the aggressive impulses. They suppressed the adrenaline response genes. They wanted to build a utopia free of human violence. Over a few thousand years, your ancestors forgot where they came from. You called yourselves the Concordat. But beneath the pointy ears and the fancy energy weave clothing, you're human, Commander, Jackson stated bluntly. You're the soft, gentle cousins who left home. And while you spent the last 5 millennia writing poetry and building glass towers, we stayed behind in the mud, fighting the monsters we created. We became the monsters, so you wouldn't have to. The silence in the command tent was deafening. Bradley looked at his hands, trembling slightly. The pacifism, the deep-seated revulsion to violence that defined his entire species. It wasn't enlightenment. It was a genetic cage built by terrified refugees who wanted to forget the sins of their fathers. So, Bradley whispered, the realization crushing the breath from his lungs. We are not ascended. We are just domesticated. You survived, Jackson said, his tone softening slightly. That's all that matters. But the universe doesn't care about pacifism, Arthur. The universe is a dark, cold jungle. And right now, the tiger is at your throat. It's time to stop hiding. Hawthorne slammed his fist onto the holotable, bringing the tactical map back up. Enough family history. We have a hive node to kill. I'm sending the 101st Orbital Dropshock Troopers down into the tunnels. Commander Bradley, I need your men to hold the surface perimeter. Can your people shoot straight if we give them real guns? Bradley looked up, his eyes hardening. The pacifist conditioning in his blood screamed at him to run, to negotiate, to seek a peaceful resolution. But the memory of the Aegis exploding, of his crew bleeding out on the bridge, silenced the genetic whispers. Give us the weapons, General, Bradley said, his voice steady. Show us how to use them. The subterranean tunnels beneath Nova Prime were a descent into hell. What was once a pristine automated subway system had been transformed into a biomechanical nightmare. The walls were coated in a thick, pulsating black resin. Veins of glowing green bioluminescence provided the only light, casting long, horrific shadows. The air was suffocatingly hot, smelling of sulfur, ozone, and rotting organic matter. Corporal Thomas Jenkins walked point with Sergeant James Brooks. Jenkins was no longer carrying his sleek plasma rifle. In his hands, he awkwardly gripped a human-made Heckler & Koch close-quarters scattergun. It was heavy, brutal, and kicked like an angry beast. But after watching it tear a swarm drone in half, Jenkins had quickly learned to love it. Behind them, a squad of heavily armored human marines marched with grim determination, escorting a massive, hovering sled. On the sled rested a Lockheed Martin tactical thermonuclear warhead, modified for subterranean detonation. "Keep your eyes peeled, kid," Brooks growled over the local comms, the heavy beams of his exosuit cutting through the gloom. "The closer we get to the core, the thicker the bugs are going to be. They know we're coming." "Sergeant Brooks," Jenkins whispered, his finger hovering outside the trigger guard of the shotgun. "Commander Bradley relayed the truth to us about our shared ancestry." Brooks grunted, his heavy boots crushing a patch of alien resin. "Yeah? How's the squad taking it?" "It is difficult," Jenkins admitted, "to learn that our entire culture is a reaction to your violence. To know that we are, fundamentally, the same species." "Don't overthink it, Corporal," Brooks said, raising his massive rotary cannon as they approached a wide intersection in the tunnels. "You chose peace. That's a luxury. But peace has a cost, and it's usually paid in blood by someone standing on a wall in the dark. Today, that's us." Suddenly, the green bioluminescence in the tunnel flared violently. A high-pitched mechanical screech echoed off the walls, vibrating in Jenkins' dental fillings. "Contact!" yelled Private Miller from the rear guard. From the ceiling, from the walls, from the very floor, they emerged. The swarm didn't attack in waves. They attacked like a flood. Hundreds of heavily armored, scythe-limbed drones poured into the intersection, moving with terrifying speed. "Light 'em up!" Brooks roared. The tunnel erupted into a deafening cacophony of kinetic violence. The human marines didn't flinch. They braced their exosuits and unleashed a wall of lead and depleted uranium. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness, tearing through the swarm vanguard. Jenkins froze for a fraction of a second, the pacifist programming in his DNA trying to seize his muscles. But then, a massive drone lunged at him, its jaws unhinged, revealing rows of spinning mechanical teeth. Jenkins didn't think. He reacted. He thrust the shotgun forward and pulled the trigger. The roar of the weapon was absolute in the confined space. A storm of tungsten buckshot caught the drone midair, shredding its head and thorax. The beast's momentum carried it forward, its heavy corpse crashing into Jenkins and pinning him to the ground. He shoved the dead weight off, his heart hammering in his chest, a surge of pure, unfiltered adrenaline, a chemical his ancestors had tried to breed out of him flooding his veins. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. "Push through," Brooks ordered, wading into the tide of monsters. He wasn't just shooting, he was using the sheer mass of his exosuit to batter the creatures. He grabbed a leaping drone by its throat, crushed its windpipe with a sickening crunch, and tossed it aside before spinning up his rotary cannon again. The squad fought inch by bloody inch, the tunnel floor slick with green ichor and spent brass casings. They lost 2 Marines, dragged into the darkness by sheer numbers, their dying screams cut short over the comms. But the humans didn't break. They were a relentless, unstoppable force of nature. Finally, they breached the central cavern. It was massive, the size of a cathedral. In the center, suspended by thick, mechanical tendrils over a pool of bubbling geothermal magma, was the hive node. It was an amalgamation of human industrial design and twisted alien biology, a massive, beating mechanical heart. Warning. Unauthorized access detected. A distorted, archaic, synthetic voice boomed through the cavern, speaking in a dead human tongue. Initiating extreme defensive measures. From the pool of magma rose the Praetorians. They were 3 times the size of standard shock troopers, plated in armor that glowed with dispersed heat. "Miller, prime the package," Brooks yelled, turning his weapon on the giant beasts. "Jenkins, keep the little ones off his back!" Jenkins fell back, planting his feet beside the nuclear sled. He pumped the shotgun, firing into the swarm of smaller drones trying to flank them. He was no longer a Concordat soldier playing at war. He was a human, fighting for his life in the dirt. The Praetorians charged. The human marines focused their fire, but the beast's armor was too thick. One of them swung a massive scythe, cleaving a marine entirely in half, exosuit and all. "Armor piercing, now!" Brooks roared. He dropped his rotary cannon, drew a massive, shoulder-fired rocket launcher, and fired directly into the chest of the lead Praetorian. The shaped charge detonated, blowing a hole straight through the creature, but the remaining 2 closed in. "Bomb is primed! 2 minutes to detonation!" Miller screamed, right before a Praetorian spike impaled him, lifting him off the ground. Fall back! Brooks yelled, drawing his serrated combat knife. Get to the surface! Now! Jenkins hesitated. We cannot leave you. That's an order, kid. Run! Brooks charged the remaining Praetorian, plunging his knife into the joint of its knee, buying the survivors time. Jenkins didn't want to leave, but the survival instinct took over. He joined the remaining 2 Marines, sprinting back down the tunnel as fast as his legs could carry him. The countdown echoed in his helmet. 60 seconds. They ran through the dark, slipping on the gore of their previous battle. The tunnel shook as the Praetorians roared behind them. 30 seconds. They reached an access shaft. The Marines grabbed Jenkins, their exosuits propelling them up the ladder at superhuman speeds. 10 seconds. They breached the surface, bursting out of a grating into the ruined streets of Nova Prime, diving behind the heavy treads of a Terran tank. 0. The ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. A muffled, world-ending thump reverberated through the bedrock of Arcadia. The street collapsed inward, a massive sinkhole swallowing the ruins of the plaza. A plume of pulverized rock, green fire, and radioactive ash shot hundreds of feet into the air, painting the sky with the violent signature of human intervention. The screeching of the swarm across the planet stopped. Instantly. The drones that were engaging the perimeter defenses simply collapsed, their connection to the hive nodes severed, their biological functions terminating without the central command matrix. Silence fell over Nova Prime. The thick smoke began to clear, revealing the first rays of the dawn sun breaking through the atmosphere. Jenkins lay in the dirt, gasping for air. He looked at his hands, covered in mud, grease, and alien blood. He looked up at the towering human tanks, and the surviving Marines who were already reloading their weapons, their faces grim, mourning their dead in silence. Commander Bradley walked over to Jenkins, offering him a hand. Bradley's pristine uniform was gone, replaced by a soot-stained tactical vest. It's over, Bradley said softly. The fleet in orbit is mopping up the uncoordinated remnants. Arcadia is saved. Jenkins took his commander's hand and stood up. He didn't feel saved. He felt awakened. Admiral Jackson approached, lighting a fresh cigar and taking a deep drag. He looked out over the ruined city, then at the Concordat soldiers holding human weapons. You boys did good today, Jackson said, his voice a low gravel. But this was just a splinter fleet. The main swarm body is still out there in the deep dark, and now they know we're awake. Bradley nodded slowly. The Concordat owes you a debt that can never be repaid, Admiral. We will return to our core worlds. We will rebuild. Jackson chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. He turned to face Bradley, and the weight of 10,000 years of warfare seemed to rest in the human's eyes. You misunderstand, Arthur, Jackson said coldly. We didn't just cross the void to pull you out of the fire. The swarm is our mess, and we are going to clean it up. But we're short on manpower. And since you just discovered you're part of the family, Jackson gestured to the thousands of drop pods, the massive dreadnoughts lingering in orbit, and the sheer, terrifying industrial war machine that had descended upon their peaceful world. We aren't here to join the Concordat, Jackson stated, the reality of the new galaxy settling over them like an iron shroud. We're drafting you. Welcome back to the Terran Alliance, Commander. Playtime is over. We have a war to win. If you enjoyed this gritty, explosive dive into HFY lore, smash that like button and hit subscribe. Your support helps us bring more epic, battle-tested stories from the darkest corners of the galaxy straight to your screen. Drop a comment below. Would you survive in the Terran Alliance, or are you staying in the Concordat bunkers? Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and as always, keep watching the stars. See you in the next one.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, humans were only ancient rumours to them until we joined the battle. HFY Sci-Fi stories. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was awe mixed with relief. I really enjoyed how humanity entered the story not as unstoppable heroes, but as a forgotten legend that returned when hope seemed lost. What made the ending memorable wasn't just the action, it was seeing courage, experience, and responsibility come together when others had nowhere left to turn. I'm curious which moment stood out to you most. Was it the first appearance of the Terran fleet, the revelation about humanity's connection to the Concordat, or the final battle against the Swarm? And if you had been in Commander Bradley's place, how would you have reacted after learning the truth about your own history? One lesson I took from this story is that understanding where we come from can change how we face the future. In everyday life, taking time to learn from past experiences can help us make better decisions when challenges appear. If this story sparked your imagination or gave you something to think about, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories about resilience, legacy, and human determination, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you'd like to see more.